This is Daniel Fulco, Agnita Stine Schreiber Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, Maryland. It's my great pleasure to welcome you back to the Curator's Den, a program in which I look at various works of art from the museum collection and reveal some of the fascinating stories behind them. In today's edition, I'm going to be examining a semi-permanent display that we have in our Kirstein Gallery, installed late last fall, called The Aid to Abstraction, Modernism and Innovation. And in this new installation, we've presented different stories from the museum's collection of works of art, primarily produced in America, from around 1900 through the late 1980s, early 1990s. So today we're going to be exploring the first half of the installation, and there will be a second half at a future edition of this program. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and we will launch into the presentation. Before we begin, I would just like to thank several sponsors, particularly for this program, the Curator's Den. A thanks to the Volvo Group, and also for the actual installation itself. The museum is most grateful to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Kirstein, the Nora Roberts Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, Washington County Gaming Commission, and architectural project management provided by Bushy Fight and Moran Architects Incorporated, who were helpful in the and generous in the original gallery refurbishment in 2015. But what we have done here is given the gallery a fresh exhibition of art from our permanent collection. So without further ado, the installation and the concept behind the exhibition begins with a group of artists known as the Eight. And from the Eight, we will be moving through a variety of artists working in the 20s and 30s, around the time of FDR's New Deal, and coming up to and concluding with a little bit of movements towards abstraction as we approach mid-century, that is the mid-20th century. These are just some gallery shots to give you a sense of how we've reconceived the installation to include both decorative arts, but also paintings and sculptures. And at the turn of the 20th century, American artists began to respond to the social realities of a new era. And by that, I mean that they were inspired by a variety of charismatic artists. They started to look for new methods and modes of self-expression, moving away in some regards from traditional landscape and traditional subjects that you would associate with more academic painting. And by academic, I mean highly realistic, highly polished representations of the human figure found in the work of famous American portraitists, but also in terms of the American tradition of Hudson River School painting, and also looking at specifically subjects derived from historical sources like the Bible or mythology. They begin to move away from these trends and begin to experiment with the application of paint across the surface of the canvas, and also explore new possibilities in terms of sculpture, like you see here, and we will get to this piece on the next time. So this just gives you a sense of how we've redone the Kirstein Gallery, keeping some favorites in the display, such as the Norman Rockwell, which we will get to towards the end of the presentation, and one of the most beloved works in our collection, to works that are seldom seen. And some of those are going to be discussed today. But it's been really very interesting putting together this display, completed about mid-October of 2021. So the installation in the Kirstein Gallery begins with an artist group known as the Eight. And this was spearheaded by an artist named Robert Henry, whom you may have heard of. And he was loosely affiliated with a group of artists that began their association in Philadelphia, but would later relocate to New York. And some of his chief partners in this were John Sloan and George Lukes, but there were others who joined the gang as well, over time falling in some ways under his influence and or studying with him. Those included Everett Chin and William Glackens, and also Ernest Lawson, Arthur B. Davies, and then artists who shared a similar aesthetic in terms of going against the grain of academic painting that we will examine today include Guy Pen-Dubois, Jerome Meyers, and briefly also George Bellows. But there's a core group of these artists who team up with Robert Henry, and this was specifically in response for Henry to being rejected from the National Academy of Design in New York's annual exhibition in 1908. And a group of those artists would basically break off from the Academy, and they would gather for a seminal exhibition at the Macbeth Gallery, famously founded by William Macbeth, an important art dealer in New York City. Thereafter, the group would be known as the Eight. And Henry and his associates embraced a modern sensibility, and they sought inspiration in daily urban life, like in the painting that you see on the lower left here, called Snow in New York from 1902. For Henry, what he's interested in is looking at the grittiness of everyday life, the realities, not like the Hudson River School painters previously in the 19th century, and even some artists like the tonalists, who created very dreamy pictures of sort of idyllic landscapes influenced by French Barbizon tradition from the mid-19th century. For Henry, he's going totally against this kind of style of representation, and instead he brings us into the grayness, the bleakness of New York City in the winter, in this well-known canvas in the National Gallery of Art in DC. John French Sloan also is interested in urban life, and he paints pictures such as McSorley's Bar in 1912. Oftentimes, John Sloan would take us out onto the streets, but in other cases, he went into bars and restaurants and showed us the interactions between people, like you see these gentlemen who are socializing at this establishment, enjoying drink and conversation. For them, it was this aspect of city life that is non-sentimental, that's straightforward, and that shows us the everyday condition of people and their interactions. George Luke's as well, with his Houston Street from 1917, he shows us the life of people who would have dwelled in tenements in New York City at the time. And he brings us right into the street. And he includes this interesting element of the woman painted very loosely and almost dreamily as she looks out at us from the picture. Other artists are going to pick up on this aesthetic. And I will show you some examples from our collection, which contains quite a few representative examples of the Eight. For Robert Henry and his colleagues, they advocated diversity, spontaneity, and what they referred to as authenticity in art. It was really this aspect of what we see in front of us that fascinated them the most. The installation begins with a survey of some of the works of the Eight, with this portrait of Michael, a little boy whom Henry painted when he traveled to Ireland, and specifically his first trip to Akil Island, County Mayo in Western Ireland in 1913. It's a very lively portrait, and it depicts a little boy named Michael Red Lavelle, his nickname being Red, who interestingly later, when he grew up, remembered wearing a new hand-knit sweater for the sitting, and he recalled the artist fondly. So for Henry, he brings us right up close and personal with this little kid, painting his rosy cheeks and showing us the sort of glistening effects of the light shining off of his pupils as he looks out at us, but his clothing is very loosely sketched. This impasto technique, by that I mean thick brush strokes that Robert Henry uses, shows that aspect of immediacy, of spontaneity. And it's this aesthetic that Robert Henry is going to pass on to his colleagues, particularly somebody like John Sloan. Now, when we get down here to Windy Day, Sloan was very well known and did do paintings, of course, of the aspects of urban society, grittiness of it, that you can see, for example, I'll show you in the next slide, of people on the streets, but he also was interested in the landscape. And I point that out because for the Eight, it wasn't exclusively urban subjects. There is an interest in landscape painting, but certainly not in the tradition of Hudson River School by any means. Sloan became attracted to the style of Robert Henry. And like Henry and their other colleagues, Sloan began as an illustrator for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And particularly, it was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts that Sloan originally met and studied under Henry. And Henry encouraged Sloan and their other colleagues to begin painting as a career in addition to doing illustrations. So much so that Sloan would eventually move to New York City in 1903, and he would paint scenes of the daily life of tenement dwellers. He would continue that actually until much later in his career. But the example we have in the collection here is from a period in which he was up in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And Windy Day is likely a sketch that the artist completed outdoors, as we say, en plein air. And he actually created from these sketches over 300 finished oil paintings using Gloucester's rugged landscape as an inspiration to experiment with color and explore form. You could almost feel the wind in this painting sort of carrying you away, blowing against the figures that are very abstractly represented, and also shown here by the impasto brush strokes on the foliage of the tree that seems to sway in the current of the winds. Our collection also has several works by other artists. Now, these aren't on view. I should mention that these two, if you come to the museum, the Henry, Michael, and Windy Day are in the Kirsten Gallery. These, though, are up in storage, but I bring them to sort of fill out the picture of this important group known as the Eight. George Bellows, one of Sloan's and Henry's colleagues, did a series of lithographs, bringing us right into the grittiness of what it meant to be an American soldier during World War I. And here we have this officer who's sort of raising his fist and sort of pushing against this other soldier on the right-hand side. We have vignettes showing soldiers who are taking a rest here, but behind this embankment is a battle that's actually ensuing. And this one is very visceral, very gestural. It almost has the effect of a drawing. And it's really quite interesting to look at these works. This is not in any ways an idealized scene. And in fact, look at this soldier here, he's barely clothed. And another one is hiding behind him. One of them is very wounded or perhaps dead, who's hiding behind this soldier here. So it really shows us the harsh realities of serving in World War I, one of the most devastating military confrontations in history. George Luke's, pardon me, this is just called Portrait of a Girl, it's not Michael. This painting by George Luke's, probably dating from the early 20th century, somewhere around the 1910s, is a very direct, immediate portrayal of this young woman who is unidentified, unlike Michael, shown up above, for which we have information and documentation. We don't know who she is, but it's a very straightforward and direct, dignified representation of this young woman who looks out at us again with that direct gaze from the picture itself, making us ponder what it is exactly that she's thinking. The two works on the left are on view in the Kirsten Gallery. Jerome Meyers, who is at first not directly associated with the Eight, but later joins the group. And I'm very fond of this painting, The Grandmother, because it shows us the aspect of this immigrant experience. And that's another thing that I am looking at and that I conceived in terms of putting together the Eight Abstraction, Modernism Innovation, is to include stories about immigrants depicted, but also artists who are immigrants. And you will be seeing that in this two-part series. But for Meyers, he's fascinated by New York City's tenement dwellers. And that's what you see here, is this grandma who's on the streets of New York with her grandchildren, holding the baby in her arms very tightly, and then the other two children are almost clutching at her skirts. The other children in the neighborhood are shown here. We don't get to see the facades of the apartment buildings, but we see them on the street engaged in their activities. The subdued palette is another characteristic of the group of 8 artists. I should also add that they were termed by some critics at the time as the Ashcan group. And Ashcan was sort of a little bit of a derogatory term because they depicted people literally in the alleys and in the streets. But we prefer often these days to use the term the eight. And it's typical, this work, of Jerome Meyers' sympathetic, down-to-earth imagery of urban immigrants. He likes to empathize with their condition. While Meyers was not part of the 1908 exhibition featuring Henry and the other artists, his imagery really became very closely connected to the association. The same goes for an artist named Ernest Lawson. Ernest Lawson's Shepherd in the Forest shows how the landscape was very important to this group of painters. And this is more beholden to impressionistic art and also to some degree tonalism, but Lawson actually becomes connected to Henry and this group of artists. His, though, is much more pastoral. But the reason why I bring him in is because of this association with the artist. He shares their ideals and commitment to painting life without aggrandizement or idealization. Again, thick brushstrokes applied to the surface of the canvas. I really love the use of the whites and the grays contrasted with the greens as we're brought into the forest interior, and the shepherd almost becomes blended in with the entire composition, almost obscuring the composition itself. Now, as a total contrast, this is an example of John French Sloan going to the streets of New York, and in this case, showing us life on a ferry commute called The Wake on the Ferry, which is one of his etchings. It shows tremendous spontaneity, economical use of line, and contrast between light and dark. This being as late as 1949, just shy of a few years before he died. And this is in our collection, but it's not on view in the installation. Another artist who's associated with the eight, who's quite important, is Guy Pen du Bois. Our museum has a long history with Guy Pen du Bois because in January 1940, we had a very large exhibition that was co-organized with several museums at the time, including what used to be the Norfolk Museum of Arts and Sciences and the Mint Museums located in Charlotte, North Carolina. For this collaborative exhibition, it brought together many works, like this one conversation piece that's shown on the left and pictured on our bulletin from January 1, 1940. Now, not long after that exhibition, we received a gift of our Guy Pen du Bois, Bobby Posing. Pen du Bois had originally studied in New York under William Merritt Chase. He goes to Europe and studies with Théophile Steinlen, an important French lithographer, but upon returning home, he befriended a number of painters of the eight, including Jerome Meyers, who became a friend of his. But Bobby Posing is quite an unusual work, as I'll show you, in contrast to some of his other paintings, because it's an early work strongly influenced by the mood, the tonality, and the brushwork of the eight in the 1910s. And in contrast to the artist's later satirical, sometimes wry representations of urban life, this picture is highly introspective. He shows us again, like with George Luke's, the boy looking out at us with this sort of enigmatic expression. And we see the pictorial elements, such as the chair, the boy himself and his costume, almost blend in with the coloring of his surroundings. A picture posted up here on the wall and a blocked up fireplace along with the mantelpiece. Look at how different Bobby Posing is from the diners, which had appeared on the art market a couple of years ago. This is that sort of wry satirical depiction that Du Bois is best known for. The diners seemingly almost alienated from one another in a manner similar to artists like Edward Hopper. They seem to not have a connection to one another. They don't really want to be there. These are the kinds of depictions that we know him best for. Or Soldier and Peasant in the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. Two figures, very close spatially to one another, but they don't have really a connection. Here, it's really a close-up in terms of the young boy. And something within the picture has just attracted his attention, such that the artist effectively focuses us on Bobby through these coloristic juxtapositions. In addition to the eight in the exhibition, I've tried to bring up works in the collection that tell different stories, including that of Native Americans during the early to mid 20th century. One such artist was Edward Willard Demain, whose Departure of the Hunters is such a poetic picture. And he is very well known for creating tranquil, contemplative representations of Native Americans going about their daily life. Like members of the Eight, Demain was an illustrator. He painted the American West, and as a child, he grew up with members of various First Nations, including the Sac, Fox, and Winnebago peoples in Western Illinois. He would eventually travel west with fellow artist Ducoste Smith and the renowned Frederick Remington to complete illustrations of the Sioux and Crow Native American tribes for Outing magazine. And the painting that we have on the left, I believe, dates from that period of time where he's out west living amongst the Native Americans. And I should add that even though he was a white American living with them, he nevertheless was very much liked by them, so much so that in his later life, the Blackfeet peoples in Montana adopted Demain and his entire family, giving the artist the name of quote unquote 8 Bears. So these depictions are certainly idealized, such as Indian hunting buffalo on the right-hand side, or Blackfoot camp scene, probably from the 1910s to 20s, but they are very much sympathetic to their condition and beautifully painted, almost influenced by Impressionism and tonalism of the late 19th century. So at the same time, you have these gritty urban scenes that are being produced back in New York. You have artists like Demain and his colleagues such as Remington or Ducoste Smith, who are looking at the Native Americans' life, which at the time was very much being displaced, certainly by the 19th century, and of course the Native American reservations. But Demain nevertheless became involved with creating a series of large mural paintings for which Blackfoot camp scene is likely a study. Another key artist as part of this installation in the Karstien Gallery is Edward Steichen. This is among my favorites in the museum's collection. It's called The Yellow Moon. Now, many of us probably know Edward Steichen much better for his photographs, but originally he's trained as a painter and a lithographer. And those processes in terms of manipulating light and dark play out in his compositions. Yellow Moon is one of the rare survivors of Edward Steichen's pictorial oeuvre that is of oil on canvas paintings, because sadly in 1922, after he came back from World War I, he was staying in France and he burned all of his canvases, which is so tragic. After that, he would dedicate himself solely to producing photographs. So Yellow Moon on the left is one of those survivors. It's so poetic. It's so introspective, this painting. Look at how the moon emerges from the horizon line there through these trees that resemble birches or poplars. And look at the reflection of the moonlight off the pond in the foreground. It's just stunning, this painting. And on the right-hand side, here's a similar example, though not quite as blue and icy as our example, Nocturne, from about 1903 in the Snite Museum of Art at University, Notre Dame, Indiana. And they have an affinity with photographs that he was creating at the time, specifically the pond Moonlight from 1904, a multiple gum bichromate plate in the MoMA in New York City. You see how he's trying to explore at this time the parallels between painting and photography, colors which convey a sense of coolness, but also reflection. At the time, the artist described, and I quote, "I knew, of course, that trees and plants had roots, stems, bark, branches, and foliage that reached up toward the light. But I was coming to realize that the real magician itself, mysterious and ever-changing light with its accompanying shadow, rich and full of mystery." These words really speak to these paintings and show us the direction in which he would move his work, such as Flatiron Building, an iconic image, another gum bichromate over platinum print. Or his portrait here when he was over in France of Henri Matisse, creating one of his sculptures where he's deliberately blurred the composition. As time went on, he would produce works connected to things going on in World War II, such as Navy Hellcat roars off flight deck of the Blue Ghost on the USS Lexington in 1943. So Steichen is really an interesting artist in terms of the transition between late tonalist painting, pictorialist photography as it was known at that time, and the emergence of more abstract modernism. And in terms of the abstraction, we have artists in this installation who are lesser known and that I wanted to bring to light, such as the very little known Hamilton Akio Wolfe, who was the son of a famous printmaker of the late 19th century, Henry Wolfe, who created portrait wood engravings. And before choosing an art career, Hamilton Wolfe worked as a bank teller. And that's an important thing to point out, that a lot of artists working in mid-20th century America who are not very recognized had 2 or 3 different positions, either as illustrators, but also working day jobs at night being painters. Now for Wolfe, he was able to actually make a living of this, later becoming a teacher at the Los Angeles School of Art and Design beginning in the 1910s, and later moving on to the faculty of the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. But what's interesting about Wolfe is he creates figural compositions, but he starts to explore abstract elements, such as in Annunciation, in which he starts to break down the pictorial space and look at how light plays across the surface of the canvas as it reflects on this woman. Like the Bobby posing by Guy Pen Dubois, something has caught her attention in the composition. She looks off towards the left. The painting almost has an Art Deco type feel to it. And Art Deco is something that's touched upon in this installation as well. This was a concurrent movement that explored, again, the beginnings of abstraction and having conversations with traditional art, but also looking at the breakdown of pictorial space and geometric forms in painting, as well as decorative art and in architecture. Or Wolfe's The Afternoon at the Market from about the 1920s or 30s. For him, and artists such as Sarah Stafford Goodwin, they sort of border on something that we call social realism. It emerged around the time of the New Deal, and it dealt with American values pertaining to hard work, diligence, and industry. Goodwin, a Delaware-based artist, created this farm scene likely as a study for a mural in a post office. And while we don't know whether or not this was a commission as a result of FDR's New Deal and the Works Progress Administration, which was very important at the time, otherwise known as WPA, it nevertheless speaks to the various industries of Delaware, including the raising of livestock, grain harvesting, and dairy production. So you have a variety of artists who are working at this time in very different styles and in different media. Now, quite different from these artists that we've looked at, we have Norman Rockwell's The Oculist, a beloved painting. Rockwell became very renowned for his over 322 illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post. And in this one of the reasons why people became so intrigued by his work and why it became so popular is because he could relate to many Americans' condition at the time, sort of empathizing with them. And in this case, the freckled-faced boy being fitted for glasses, but he doesn't really want to be here. And he has his baseball glove ready to go for action and a Brooklyn Dodgers cap that's tucked to his belt. He would much rather be on the playing field than indoors being fitted for the glasses. It embodies his remarkable capacity for exploring human nature, but also his technical gift for exploring detail with precision. And you can see that here. It's really something that draws a lot of people into his compositions. And then on the right-hand side, this is what the post cover actually looked like. Now, the story behind this painting is really neat in terms of how the museum acquired it. It was bought by our former director, Bruce Etches, in 1957. And while at the time, Norman Rockwell did fetch much higher prices than what the museum could afford, he agreed to lower his prices so that Washington County Museum of Fine Arts could acquire one of his illustrations. And that's what happened at the time. Through the intermediation of his art agent, we were able to purchase this for a modest price at the time. And one of the things that impelled Bruce Etchison to purchase this was that it reminded him of his own son, as he had recorded in the museum archives at the time. I should also mention that the painting was conserved, and it was retouched in certain areas and placed under glass to keep it protected. In wrapping up today, I would just like to preview a couple of works that next time I will be pulling into the conversation. And as I've mentioned, we are including artists in this installation who are outside America to show how their work parallels that of their colleagues across the Atlantic Ocean, with people, again, not household names, but very interesting artists, such as Dujan Penic, a Croatian modernist, better known René Lalique, an Art Deco designer who created beautiful art glass objects, such as this, a chamois vase. And also we're going to look at some artists closer to home. Charles Hugo Wolfe, this beautiful abstraction, Charles Hugo Wolfe being a Baltimore modernist, and also Nikolai Kuvshinov way across the country in Washington State, working in Seattle. So I hope that you will join me next time for our second installment of the exploration of this new installation, the 8th Abstraction, Modernism and Innovation. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.